Episode 237.
Well, hello, sweetheart.
Hi, sweetheart.
Yeah, thank you for joining me for another dialogue at Jerry and Abigail, an intimate dialogue.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm Scott Langdon. This week on God and Autobiography, the podcast, we bring you the latest edition of Jerry and Abigail, an intimate dialogue. In this episode, Jerry and Abigail discuss Jerry's new book, Radically Personal, God and Ourselves in the New Axial Age. In this new book, Jerry, as philosophers do, probes his experience of his encounter with God for meaning and understanding. Abigail also shares her story of an encounter that in one sense prepared her to accept Jerry's experience as not only valid, but very important. I hope you enjoy the episode.
God and Autobiography is about 90% God talking.
Yeah.
This has some God talk because I quote a lot, but this is the book I've written, which is my effort at faith seeking understanding, faith in the sense of the spiritual experience, the divine encounter, and now as a philosopher, how to understand it. And also, I was given at some point the project of starting a Theology Without Walls. And I don't know that we've really talked about that on the podcast. I guess there's been references to it. But this book also explains that project in this radically personal mode. And of this title, I think what we'll be emphasizing today, sweetheart, is the word personal. Shortly after my first encounter with the divine voice, I received the instruction, I want you to tell my story. Well, that was very puzzling, what that could mean, how I should do that. But I was promptly guided to go read the foundational scriptures, the ancient sacred texts of the world's religions, including religions that don't survive to the current day, like ancient Egyptian religion. But they were also having a divine encounter. And it turned out from that, if you ask, what is God's story? God's story was, in effect, the story of God's interaction with various cultures and religions and prophets and so forth in those cultures. And that was the story to be told. And it was surprising because most people who start thinking, oh, well, there's some divine truth in multiple traditions, start wanting to say, yeah, and they all say the same thing, as if that followed almost automatically. If God is behind all of them, even the non-theistic religions, then somehow at bottom, they must all say the same thing. But what I discovered, what I would do is read the sacred text and then pray about them. And what in the old days they call Lectio Divina, which was praying your way through the Bible. You would read some parts and then pray about them to seek understanding. Well, I was doing that with these ancient scriptures, and in each case asking basically, God, what were you up to with these people at this time and when you said such and such according to their scriptures? And they don't all say the same thing because God didn't tell them the same thing. And so that's an interesting thing. And more is said about that, of course, elsewhere. But it kind of makes sense. You look at the religions, they don't seem to be saying the same thing. And so it wasn't a big leap of understanding to think, they say different things, and yet somehow God is behind them. And it doesn't mean every word of each religion is true or accurate or valid, but God is somewhere behind that set of revelations, enlightenments, illuminations, and so forth. And what struck me, and I guess was suggested by the way God was talking to me about these things, is that this carries all the way down to the individual level. God was doing something different with the ancient people of Israel and the ancient Chinese and the ancient this and that, because he had different missions for them in part. There was something he wanted them to do. I use the word he. God is not very gendered, but he, she, it, whatever is most comfortable for you. But God had something God was seeking from each culture. Sometimes it was a response to the needs of the culture, sometimes to the culture's particular capabilities that God could make use of. And sometimes it's just, here's your assignment, report for duty, here's your assignment. And that carries down to the personal level that, okay, Jerry, here's your assignment. Okay, Abigail, here's your assignment. Scott Langdon, Laura Buck, Amanda Horgan, all working in my team. Each one was brought there not because we all have the same assignment, other than, of course, it's the same project, but in each individual's life, this has a different meaning. It's a different meaning for why Abigail here, why Jerry's here, why each of those other people I named are here doing this work. And in fact, they each have their own story. It's how this fits into their story. So anyway, this is a radically personal, means you have to carry it all the way down. And the challenge for each individual is to figure out, where is God most accessible to me? Where do I detect the divine? God made it easy for me by speaking in a voice. For most people, it's not like that. So where do you go? You go to prayer, to meditation. It means you have to trust the intimations that come to you. Sometimes there is a sense of divine presence in a certain setting or scene or ritual, in a religious context or in some other context, or in nature or in music or art, or many other places you can look. And if you detect the divine, then make the most of that. I guess one of the message of radically personal is what I call an epistemics of trust. Before you reject an experience, even if it seems odd, doesn't quite make sense with maybe secular worldview or naturalistic worldview or science or some other thing like that, or some official doctrines, but before dismissing the experience, take it in and see what you can learn from it. And there may be hints of the divine. It may only be hints in the mix of a whirly-burly of experience, hints of the divine. Well, sweetheart, you've lived with me, and we each have our own journey, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? I guess is the question.
That made 105% sense to me. I had that I can recall, no inner qualms or wait a minute, or I have to put in this parenthesis, no reservations. It seemed to make sense and to make acceptable in a way. If God thought it was respectable, maybe it was respectable. Journeyings of mine to attaching myself at one point to a guru until something occurred that made this seem like a risky spiritual course for reasons peculiar to that situation. But I've done hatha yoga for many years, and I didn't think that was betraying the cause of being Jewish. And I'm
wondering, how do you relate those things? I thought at the beginning with God and Autobiography that this would be hardest for the Jews, because the Jews need to keep a tradition going. That they were given the covenant and they're still under the covenant, And how do you keep that going? Because the kids go marry out and so forth. And this idea, like a theology without walls, taking in the divine truth wherever you find it, not necessarily just in your own niche, or even in your own divine assignment. Even if something's your assignment, there can be divine truth elsewhere. God. But anyway, how I've not found that to be the case, and that
No,
puzzled me.
the Jewish view, the Israelite view, as evidenced in the Hebrew Bible, is that you can be the justest man on earth, as Job is deemed to be by God and God's adversary, and not be Jewish at all. The righteous Gentile has been, at least since rabbinic times, and in a number of instances in the Hebrew Bible, a quite theologically acceptable. Let me see, there's a rabbinic saying, something like the righteous Gentile has a spiritual status equivalent to the high priest of the Lord. So Jews don't start with the notion that a Christian theology reserves to itself, has as part of its doctrine of original sin, a notion that from which it follows that unless a special act of saving, God's incarnation in Jesus' expiation for the sin of Adam by dying on the cross, all that is absolutely outside Jewish thinking. Jews don't have a doctrine of original sin. They don't have a doctrine of only one path to acceptability with God, and they don't have a history like that. The righteous Gentile is a figure in the Bible and a figure in rabbinic thought. So all that was no theological shock to me, and it seemed very welcoming and supportive of my interest in other religions. It no longer appeared to be some kind of a under the table thing or off the record thing or something. Well, I might still not share it with my Jewish friends who feel that way, but the ones who felt that way are pretty much gone to glory, and the ones who remain don't feel that way. So it created zero theological, moral, spiritual problem for me.
If Isn't it also true? You know the New Testament better than I do. That in spite of Paul's doctrine of original sin, that's why they call it Pauline Christianity, because he really laid out the fundamental doctrines. Jesus was preaching a way of life or something, and with resonances about kingdom of God and so on. But isn't it true that in the Gospels there are significant non-Jews? And of course, non-Christians, nobody's yet a Christian. I'm thinking of the Good Samaritan, for example.
Oh, yeah, the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
Jesus was quite
And
a
Jesus doesn't say
universalist.
you're damned to the Good Samaritan.
Oh, nobody talks like that.
Nobody talked that way.
I never heard anybody say to anybody for any reason, you're damned. It just is not a threat. I have Christian friends who tossed and turned about the question, am I damned? Am I saved? That, I've had lots of troubles. My life has not been one long serenity, one long, even flow of acceptance, sweetness, and light, not by any means, but among the fears that I didn't have and never had was the fear that I was going to hell for any reason whatsoever.
So you disagree with these Christian doctrines, and yet you and I both like Christian gospel.
Oh, I
The
love
old-fashioned, totally
hillbilly.
old-fashioned Christian gospel.
Yeah,
Will God plead your case when you go to heaven?
yeah,
These kind of songs.
yeah,
And how does that fit into your own? This is the unique Abigail blend, you might
yeah.
say, of religiosity.
That's an interesting question. Well, my father was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and I guess he liked country music.
He
Uh,
became a rabbi,
he became a rabbi and then became an
philosopher.
ex-rabbi and a philosopher teacher. Um, but I think I always liked it, and I'm just wondering where that fits, since country gospel has Christian doctrines that never appealed to me. Uh, Country gospel, I'm not good at long hair music, as I call it. And so the tunes are very easy for me. And the sentiments, what a friend we have in Jesus, uh, that's easy too. And I
Right.
didn't worry about my relationship to Jesus. Uh, it didn't strike me as discordant with my inner being, with my soul, with whatever is deep in me. Well, here's a telling example. There was a time in my life, we won't go into the gory details, but suddenly I was seized with a very strong impulse to kill myself. Maybe with some romance that had not worked out. I don't remember why, but it was so strong that I felt it was almost out of my hands. And
Mm.
I thought, not time to dial 111, not time to call anybody. I put on Red Foley, brings tears to my
What was
eyes.
he singing?
I know who holds tomorrow, and I know who holds my hand. And I'm just tearful when I think of it. Red, you saved my life. Now that's pretty close to the edge. You know, that goes as deep as it goes. I
Yeah.
didn't think about Immanuel Kant, Spinoza, Plato, Aristotle, a cast of thousands. I'm relatively well read in philosophy, the wisdom of Western civilization. Uh, I've read the Bible. Um, it was good old Red Foley. You know,
If
go
that's
figure.
yeah, okay. And I always put these things in terms of like divine communications,
Ah,
but I don't know if that's necessary that you think, oh, God is directing you to put on red foley, and that's a message direct from the divine. Life seems to have more serendipity and chaos than that.
yeah,
And yet, uh, there are moments, perhaps. I mean, I'm wondering, I don't want to prejudice your answer here. At key moments in your life, here is one of them that you
yeah.
just recounted.
Mhm.
In key moments in your life, where there are difficult life decisions to make about how to go forward, or what's the next stage, or what should I do? How, and I don't know, sometimes you were a believer in God and sometimes not a believer in God.
Yeah.
So anyway, if you could just describe two or three of those and how you went about finding your way, getting some kind of guidance, because I know you don't believe you just pull it out of your own brain.
No, no.
The answers aren't all there, and I'd say.
Yeah. Well, there's a story I tell in the last chapter of my book, A Good Look at Evil. And the last two chapters are written from a standpoint distinct from the standpoint of what I wrote before. And the last chapter is titled God and the Care for One's Story. And I tell a couple of anecdotes, which I guess are signs. I can think of a third one quite recent. Um, are sort of answers to the question, how does God come into it at crucial decision points? I'm involved in a job struggle to regain my position as an assistant professor of philosophy at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. I've been fired the day after I voted for the guy who lost in a departmental election. And previous to that, the only action about me that the appointments committee had taken was to unanimously approve my promotion to the rank of associate professor. And then the next thing they did with regard to me was fire me. So I think it wouldn't take, excessive smarts to see that the firing was political. But to prove it in a bureaucratic setting took everything I got and I had and all the advice I could muster, and still this went on and on. And so I was proceeding. It was 80th Street in Manhattan, and it was a walk from
That's the headquarters, right?
headquarters of the BHE, the Board of Higher Education. And there's a concrete overhang, as I remember it, at the end of a long sloping block. And I'm all alone. I feel ridiculous, as everyone assures me I am. Give it up, Abigail. You're getting to be distorted. You're getting to be obsessive. Go move along with your life. Forget Brooklyn College. I felt I haven't seen this thing through, and it has an internal dynamic which has not exhausted itself. I haven't seen demonstrated to myself that this is hopeless. I'll give it up if I feel it's hopeless, but I haven't had that feeling yet. And here I am, all alone, looking idiotic to everybody. So and the satchel with which, furnished with all the papers of my 7 years of job struggle, is heavy. So I'm walking downhill. Hardly ever in my life felt so alone. And suddenly I sense it was partly visual, but partly imaginative. not seen, because much of this was behind me. I couldn't see it. And I didn't have the impulse to turn around and look. It wasn't that kind of vision. Connected to me as if umbilically by a cord was a long line of what I took to be rabbis. They didn't look like my grandfather. He had a white beard, looked more like God in the Sistine Chapel or Santa Claus in Macy's. These were men with black beards and curly black beards. So I had never seen them. They weren't part of personal iconography for me. They had a silvery, shimmering garment. Their feet were not visible, and they were a foot or two off the pavement on a path which was made of stuff that included them and that vibrated more quickly than we vibrate. And they brings tears to my voice. They went all the way back and back and back to the beginning of Jewish time, Ur of the Chaldees. And they said, you have been on a long pilgrimage and it is over, and you have completed it in some way. You have never been alone. You have been watched by us and whoever else counts in the unseen world. All along, you have never been alone, and it is over. And the path came to a close right under as I recall, the overhang of the Board of Higher Education. And so, entering the building and going up to my, another of my countless hearings, a sort of Daumier-like hearings where everything seemed rigged and fixed and cynical. I didn't fight for myself as I usually did at the hearings, and just slumped back and relied on the guarantee. Now, a month or two later, the word came from the union that I had been reinstated once again, but it wasn't over. It was for another year of these poisonous evaluations by enemies in the department who had a motive to find my teaching inadequate. So I said to my mother, we were up in Maine, they lied to me. The
Who's the
rabbis,
they?
the occult figures.
Okay.
Yeah, they lied to me. They told me it was over. And I thought they were rabbis. I didn't know what they were. I said, the rabbis lied to me. And yet, what actually happened was that I returned to the college for another year of poisonous evaluation and all the rest of that. And the following June, a message came from the union, a call came. I had been reinstated with tenure retroactive to the previous year, which made their assurance that it is over true. And I told the story to my friend Arlene, who, despite her modernity, is better versed in Jewish lore than I am. And she said to me, angels, they were angels. And I said, I thought angels were blonde and had wings. And Arlene replied, not Jewish angels. So, you know,
Okay.
and maybe that's anecdote enough for now.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it
That's
shows
quite a story.
it's a story. It's a story and a half. And, it breaks the routine, the pattern of what counts as normality. But for me, it was authoritative.
Yes.
It proved to be authoritative.
Yes.
I kind of let the chips fall where they fell. I was prepared to think I'd been misinformed, as Humphrey Bogart would say. But no, I had not been misinformed.
Yeah. And how did that affect your sensibility going forward from that day? I'm thinking in part, what was your takeaway that might well be what we might take from the story, from that incident?
Well, it confirmed a view I'd come to. No, I don't know if I had come to it at that point. I think I was a Spinozist or something, a rationalist in philosophy. It was evidence that there isn't just one level, the empirical level, to human experience. There's something else going on.
Well, that may be the key. That may well be the key. I'm an epistemologist, and so you think, well, what does this tell us about knowledge and understanding, and of course about the reality you're trying to understand? And if you just have the attitude of openness to there being more to the story, other levels of reality, other
Yeah.
kinds of being, other kinds of information coming in than
Yeah.
just sensory apparatus, then you can get somewhere.
And it doesn't make everything, fine and dandy. You can
Right.
still have all the despair any existentialist could want for you, and all the doubts you have. I don't go around with a simpering little smile on my face. I didn't become goody two shoes, or God will take care of it, or everything's really all right even when it's not. I, my general view of human life, human history, the way things unfold, remained on a commonsensical plane. I wasn't going to let theology obscure the view. I wanted to know what was going on, what was in it for me, what was being asked of me. Real life went on and on. And it wasn't a magic open sesame that opened the door to, heaven or anything like that. It was information.
There was information, and it remains the case. And I was told this and got an autobiography in those discussions that the world almost is defined by guilty resistance was one phrase used, but it's a very rocky terrain.
Yeah.
It's full of tension and friction. And in fact, I was told in God and Autobiography, in those prayers with God, as I was asking about all this, it's in a way, it's friction that defines reality. You know, you can have ideality floating in your head or somewhere,
Yeah.
but to be real, you need materiality, and materiality involves friction, and on and on and on. And the human beings with complex emotional systems and often kind of wicked impulses, or other times without either being exactly wicked, fighting, contending with each other, undercutting each other, maybe competitors for the path forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're right about that. I mean, that experience, you take it seriously, shows there are other levels of reality, but
Yeah.
those levels do not displace this level of reality.
Not a bit. And I had, one thing where I simply disagree on spiritual, moral, psychological, theological grounds with the doctrine of original sin, and that we were really well off before real life started. We were running around naked and very, quotes, innocent. I was never taught that we are definable as sinners, that, that we have inherited Adam's sin, the so-called original with capital O, sin, capital S, nothing like that. And I was always given to understand that the expulsion from Gan Eden, from the garden, was uh, a way of telling that we live in history. We live in a rough world. We contend for our bread and butter. There's an implication, women compete for an eligible man who'll stay by them. Men compete to be thought attractive or worthy of promotion. And that's what it's like in real life. And it's not a fall. It's not the result of somebody, our ancestor, that we have nothing to do with, having done something wrong, and then some atonement that doesn't seem even relevant to Adam's disobedience, coming to patch that up, if you believe, blah, blah, blah. And anyway, those superfluous, to my mind, artificial theological condemnations, such as the doctrine of original sin, I didn't have them. I knew it was not going to be a picnic to be Jewish. My parents did rescue work during the Holocaust. I knew what was going on. My parents thought we're going to beat Hitler, and I thought, no, maybe we aren't going to beat Hitler. Maybe Hitler's going to win. I didn't have rosy beliefs about the historical condition. I thought it was dangerous, but not really. The condition was not anybody's fault.
Yes. Well, so we make our way as best we can, but by a Jewish view, not condemned people, from condemned from birth, you might say.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we're not perfect people. We're
No.
flawed. We're flawed. And that's a lot of history is generated by the interaction of flawed people in
Yeah.
difficult circumstances, because sometimes the world itself, it's hard to find enough food. And there are volcanoes erupt and so on. And so history is that story of people contending both with the elements and with one another.
Yeah.
And in ways we might explore in a further session, somehow God is a partner. And one of the messages of Radically Personal is you need to figure out or see if you can get some sense through prayer or meditation or just what happens in your life, task put in your path, where you can best be a partner of the divine.
Yeah. And I think that the desire, the longing for purity, which I certainly had as a young woman, is a kind of a mistake. Um, uh, one of the rabbinic sayings is mankind is thought to be compounded of a good impulse and an evil impulse. And the rabbinic saying I'm thinking of goes like this: without the evil impulse, nothing would get done. You know, you're supposed to make it work for you, make it into energy, make it
These are
into,
things like energy and
yeah,
competitiveness and
yeah,
a lot of one's quest for getting something done, for getting ahead,
yeah,
means that you go build a Brooklyn Bridge or something, and then you're celebrated and
yeah.
so forth. And one of the things I've read is that there's a Jewish prayer where you pray for God to make good use of your evil impulse too.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah,
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that one.
yeah,
But yeah, I think that's the prayer.
yeah,
Uh, you know, not make me pure, make me free of um, contemptible impulses. No, I'm probably a medley, or have at times felt myself to be a medley of contemptible impulses. I don't know if that's literally the case, but anyway, certainly not a vessel of purity. No, no. Uh, God has got the evil impulse like anybody.
yeah. Well, thank you, sweetheart. This has been a very interesting discussion, and it's always good to talk with you. I talk with you at our morning seminar over breakfast,
Yeah.
and it's nice to do it in this more official mode, too. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, I very much enjoyed it. And as always,
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.